we'll get going here. Thank you everybody for joining us for another episode here of our SNEED-CAST. Another episode, sans Alexa. She is behind the camera taking notes for us. But Quentin and I will be speaking today with Brett Puffenbarger from the cannabis industry veteran since 2017. You've been working in the industry. Also a retired Marine Corps veteran. I love your handle or your phrase from your LinkedIn profile, bridging the gap from bong to boardroom, which really is the transformation I've seen of thinking back to the high school days of what it was like. Of course, you have various sales and marketing leadership roles in the industry across different companies. And I know you're a passionate cannabis proponent, ambassador, and influencer. Currently managing partner at Good Highdeas. Love a good pun, both as a dad and as a marketing person. So where you guys focus on media marketing.
Really appreciate it. I feel like not enough people, like, they mess it up and they're like, good high da 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 da. And I'm like, you've never had a good idea in your life? Like, you've never seen a clip of somebody like, that's a good, I don't know, man. Keep going. Sorry, I totally messed up your
No, that's fine. That was fine. But yeah, so at Good Highdeas, you guys are focused on media marketing and PR in the hemp and cannabis space. So very, very pleased to have you on. Thank you again, Brett, for taking time out of your day for our humble little podcast. I have Quentin here with us, who's normally behind the camera, but is also a passionate customer and of this space. So he thought he would join us here. So we'll kind of dive right in. Should I take the first? So just, I kind of done this with other guests as well. Kind of my opening question is just kind of in general, what got you on a personal level so interested in the emerging cannabis space? How did you get started? And then the passion that you have for it, on a personal level, kind of your origin story.
My favorite stories to tell. So I got into cannabis as a business because I had a rich cousin who was willing to pay way more than the prices I saw people in high school paying where I lived. So I used to just buy it and drive up and sell it to all of her rich friends. I didn't smoke it though. Like, it wasn't a thing I really did in high school. Like, I smoked joints and stuff in high school, right? Like, you do that at parties. It's pretty normal, like, social interaction. But I wasn't a weed guy. Like, I was a whiskey and Copenhagen kind of guy at the time. I didn't come to cannabis personally until after the military. I got into an argument with an ex-girlfriend, and she said something mean, basically like, you're kind of a jerk, you should smoke weed. I keep seeing articles on the internet about it. And I'm like, all right, cool. Had no idea how to do any of it, right? Like, I'd seen people smoke weed. So I literally asked the only person I knew who smoked weed at the time, which was her mom, if I could buy weed. And then I YouTubed how to make a gravity bong and that was it. And then I kind of did that whole meme of like Johnny Cash in the bushes eating the cake. Like, we've all seen that. It was me, but I cut a watermelon in half and was just eating it with a spoon, like watching Bob's Burgers. And I was like, this is it. This is why people hate their life a lot less. Like,
light bulb.
Right. And I was like, wait a minute, like, this is way great. So then I was just like a regular, illegally healed weed smoker for a long time. I was working at Harley Davidson at the time, running a pretty large sales team, right? I had like 70 people across 6 dealerships. And then one day I got a fateful call at lunch that I had to come back in because there was an accident. I'm like, all right, cool. One of my guys had knocked a motorcycle, like $40,000 custom bike off of a trailer. So everybody has to get, PP tested to make sure that we're, not high at work or drunk at work or whatever. I obviously, in my opinion, passed it, but in their opinion, failed it. And they said, bye, Brett. So I got what I thought was smart, and I had sold a bike to a guy who opened one of the first cannabis companies in Florida. And I called him and I was like, hey man, I was good enough to sell you a bike. Can I sell some weed for you? Did you know Harley makes more money selling retail, like t-shirts and leather jackets and that sort of stuff, than we actually do selling motorcycles? And he was like, no, I didn't know that. So that was kind of my jump into, here's a really fun one. This is totally off topic of cannabis, but I think will blow people's minds. So you cannot buy a new Harley Davidson outside of the United States, like an MSRP, brand new out of the factory. Every Harley available outside of the United States borders is used. So all of those dealerships you see, Harley of Dublin, Harley of Dubai, Harley of Hong Kong, those are just franchises that bought the branding, but they're basically just used car dealerships for motorcycles. what we developed at Orlando Harley when I was working there was we have the largest rental fleet in the world because it's Florida, right? Like we have huge rental fleets. We were flipping the entire rental fleet of 20 bikes at full MSRP to branded shops overseas. So like Harley of Dublin would call and pay me full sticker price because we were the only source to them of brand new model year bikes. So to them, they're living off of 3 to 5 year old bikes at the newest with, 15, 20,000 miles. We're giving them this year bikes with 3,000 or 4,000 miles because why does it hurt us? We can just re-up the rental fleet as soon as we do it. So that was a big piece of my world. Like that's my intro into like big business was like seeing that little piece, right? Like, wait a minute. Here. So you're telling me I have 55 brand new bikes out there that I already made the money back on renting. Why don't I just sell them? Why am I putting them in inventory here trying to sell them? Why don't I just sell them to, Harley of whatever, Bangkok?
Right. Interesting.
Worked out. That's fascinating.
But so you were, so your client though, your Harley Davidson client, and you were pitching him on getting into sales.
Yeah, that was it, man. So my first job in cannabis was doing like retail openings. It was me and a guy from Disney for one of the like first crop of like MSOs that came out of Florida. I guess from there, it's kind of been I had a realization when I left there that working for a plant touching operator, I can only help so many people, right? Like cannabis saved me. I can only save so many people in my mind working for a plant touching operator. That's why I moved into the B2B space, right? So everything you've seen since that point has not actually been plant touching. It's a root cause for me, right? Like I remember what it was like to jump from standard corporate America, it's Harley, right? Like jeans and a t-shirt are normal, but it's still standard corporate America, to the issues we faced in cannabis. Because back then, like when we were doing retail openings, it was so rudimentary, even here on the East Coast, that I was calling people from our rivals because nobody had ever done it before. I'm like, hey, Jordan, how did you get that sign approved for this city? Because they keep telling me I need a form that doesn't exist. Or like, hey, Victoria from True Leaf, like, can you tell me who you had to call to Magic? So it was really different, right? And that really impacted what I wanted to do. So if you look at kind of my resume from there, it's been extraction equipment. That was great. I really wanted to learn that part of the industry. But then from there, it's been primarily business services to make what I used to be's life easier, right? So banking, human resources, payments, those sort of things have become a really big passion point for me, because I think anybody who's ever been in cannabis, it doesn't take very long to hear the rumor or the myth of like, it's hard to get a bank account. Bullshit, right? Like I yelled at Exhibit one time for saying that lie, like the real guy at MJ BizCon. So my point with that is, I've always wanted to kind of tackle that myth, and that's who I am as a person, right? I'm like, cool, like what's the controversial thing I can talk about? I think the controversial thing inside the controversial thing inside the controversial thing, right? The Russian nesting doll of help and controversy really lies in selling standard Chad services to people who have never interacted with that crowd before, and vice versa, because it makes everybody stronger. So that, to make it all full circle, that brings us back to the tagline, right? Like bridging the gap from bong to boardroom. That's what I want to do, because I look like the board shorts and weed smoking guy, but I'm doing a PhD in business. So like there's a balance there.
I think also shattering perceptions, which I love some of the posts that you share. And I know that's, having those conversations with people, breaking down those myths that have been beat into our heads since, the DARE days of the 90s and the 80s, and dispelling the lazy stoner image and profile that everybody, immediately associates with cannabis. I have a couple of friends that are, fairly avid consumers or users, and they're some of the most successful people I know, and don't have any of these stereotypical issues that people commonly associate. So I love seeing how you're doing your thing where you're everything you're doing to try to break down those myths, have those conversations with people that are maybe a little bit stubborn and pig-headed with these things. And we're starting to see that here in Texas, slowly but surely. There's some companies here, granted more on the hemp side, but you know, that are Bayou City Hemp. We had the gentleman from there on recently, a couple weeks ago, and you know, he's doing the same thing, having these conversations with retailers like liquor stores, because they're really in the seltzer space now, doing THC infused seltzers, and having conversations with grocery stores and trying to, you know, like, this is no different than selling alcohol. It's in fact, it's safer, you know. So just kind of dispelling and trying to normalize cannabis use and put it on a level playing field along the lines of something like alcohol. Kind of just got on a little soapbox and tangent there myself. I apologize, Quentin.
No, I think you're on a good path there, though. I think Texas represents an interesting cross-section of the United States as it pertains to cannabis legalization, right? So, like, I'm a born and raised Virginian. So in a similar vein to Texas, I was raised as a citizen of the Commonwealth first, a citizen of the country second, right? Like, I know that, right? Like, it's the Republic of Texas first, then the USA, right? So I empathize greatly with the plight of walking through a fiercely independent and typically right-leaning world. I mean, I came from, you know, I started my cannabis career in Florida, born and raised Virginian, back here now. So I live in like a 94% red county, right? Like, I live in a very heavily red area when it comes to that. And I think it's really interesting when you start getting into the cannabis legalization talks with those folks, you hit the stigmas, right? We hit all of the kind of lazy stoner stigmas and all of those. And I think most of those are easy to unpack. And most of us have gotten those talking points down pretty quickly, right? I think the one that I see people butting up against the most isn't the Dare generation stigma talking points. It's the Jesus generation stigma talking points. I have no issue with that whatsoever, right? Like, I grew up in a heavily religious household, those sort of things. My point with that is, I think a lot of problems that we run into in that world is that cannabis is heavily left-leaning primarily, and we stick to heavily left-leaning talking points. So we end up talking, we end up talking at regulators and at politicians and at decision makers. I'm gonna die. We end up talking at them, not with them. So something I've started to get into the habit of is adopting their talking point style when approaching it. So the very first thing I like to throw out to people, and this is going to be another one of those like, oh, whoa, this is totally off topic. My favorite thing to throw out to people is that in the Bible, it literally mentions cannabis multiple times under the name cannabism, to the point that they have actually pulled historical records off of papyrus from Jerusalem that has cannabis oil as part of St. Peter's anointing oils, to the point that they think the seed growing out of St. Peter's rock could have been a variety of cannabis. And I think when you start breaking those things down, people start going, well, what the hell? Like, you know, it's the devil's lettuce, right? And then you start going the pieces of scripture where it's like, well, God gave us every seed that bears fruit and flower and seed and stem, right? Like, they do those things. Well, what's the difference, right? So when we start getting into this, like, talking point of like, well, you guys do it with alcohol, right? Yeah, they do, but they've been told alcohol is normal their whole life, right? All the way down to taking communion, right? The blood and body, all of that stuff. They don't get told the same thing about weed, even though it's right there in front of their faces. And I think sometimes that's a really interesting way to unpack that world, because most people don't. They want to understand the logic and the reason that we use all the time, right? They want to understand the safety aspect. They want to understand the health aspect. They want to understand, even, especially in those crowds, the freedom aspect, right? But what's preventing most people from really jumping into that world is that immediate thing of, that's the devil. Maybe not. So sorry for the random rant, but I'm very passionate about the right-wing cannabis world, because I think it's growing rapidly.
100%.
I think also too, Brett, and to speak in generalities, the people here, at least what we see, is the people who are big on the Jesus stuff, they typically vote in a certain way, And it's kind of shocking that we can't say to them, hey, do you want to tax something that won't tax the actual citizen? And you can generate insane tax revenue from it. And if you don't like it, that's fine, but here's another revenue source for you where
or
you...
more, right?
Or,
Look
yeah.
at Colorado.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah. And it's baffling to me because in Texas, that could be a great talking point and it would really hit hard. But it's just this weird thing where you say where we are, or not we on the left, but the left likes to parrot certain points that just don't hit in the way that we think they do, if that makes sense.
And I
No,
think
it
that's a problem.
does. I think it's also important to note that modern prohibition, like post 1937 prohibition, most of the reefer madness talking points were generated in the Southwest, right? Even down to the calling it of marijuana, right? Like that is, to be clear, a Spanish term for prepared cannabis, right? It's the finished product is marijuana, but we started using it as a pejorative for all of it with the intention of demonizing it, specifically by associating it to Hispanics and Native Americans and that
Absolutely. All these dangerous immigrants coming to the country.
Right. So I think there's a lot to that piece too, in that even if you do tackle all the other pieces, there's this kind of inherent distrust built in for both a group and a plant based on that association. I think it's interesting to see that evolution kind of play out. Like I just saw a brand get launched yesterday called Mexijuana. And I was like, okay, like we're shooting, and they're available like New Mexico, Arizona, I thought that was interesting, right? Taking that, like this kind of world we're talking about that's very controversial and convoluted and literally just going, that's it, guys.
Like, not to totally shift gears, but I think a hot thing right now is the paranoia or something around the hemp versus traditional weed debate. And I know you have a lot of thoughts on that. And I'd just be curious to hear them. I feel like I have my own thoughts on it, and those thoughts only stem from the fact that we are in a deep prohibition state in Texas. So like in my mind right now, it's like, please don't take this from us, even if it is not the most beneficial thing.
So Al,
it's kind of scary. But I would just like to hear your thoughts on it.
real quick, just to tag on to that too. The proliferation of hemp-based THC products in Texas over the last 12 to 18 months is probably what we're seeing in a lot of, you've seen across the country is insane. It has really just grown through the roof, and big companies with big investments now, which I think you got the lieutenant governor and the attorney general for Texas have already come out and said that their number one priority next year is banning hemp-derived THC products, which I don't think they're going to be successful. I think the lobbying is going to be too powerful for them. There's just too much money now and too much business investment, which the right and the Republican Party typically are usually very pro of. And then there's another thing that I think is very ironic in the state of Texas, which is we like to champion to be in the state of freedom and free speech and all these other things. And yet here we have the government telling us that we can't take a plant and use it for personal purposes that aren't harming anyone. Anyway, that was my own little, just kind of tagged a little bit on.
No, so I like where you're going with that. So I grew up hearing the phrase dirty hands, clean money being a pro like blue collar thing. I think we're starting to get to a point with modern politics where it's clean money or dirty money, clean hands, or the other way around, right? Where they want the money, right? They want to be fiscally aware. They don't want it if it's dirty money. And it kind of goes back to that social aspect of like, well, is alcohol dirtier than weed? Is one or the other? When it comes to the intoxicating hemp space or cannabinoid space or whatever you want to call it, I'll be honest with you, my opinion has drastically changed over the last 2 years. So if you go back in history, 2 years, 3 years ago, I was probably one of the first people in the LinkedIn universe who was really taking a hard stance of Delta 8 is the bathtub gin of weed and it's unsafe, and right, that was a very hard.
And it sucked too, but that's just
right. It was just gross, and I think I mentioned earlier, I worked in the extraction space, so I have a lot of extraction scientist friends, a lot of really high-end sciencey folks that I would call and ask questions to, because I don't want to hate it for no reason, right? So a couple of years ago, I was ardently against it. It's the bathtub gin. It's gross. It's dangerous. And it was, and I'm not saying it isn't now. I'm saying it definitely was, right? We went through a lot of battles over that couple of years where something like HHC, you guys know what that is, right? Like hexahydroxy. It's the most simplest intoxicating derivative of THC, but there's actually two of them, and there were no lab standards, and people were selling it, but they couldn't actually prove they were selling it. It was a big chaotic mess, right? And then we got to the THCOs and the THCPs. And as much as my opinion has changed, I think my reading of the tea leaves was correct that those were all short-term profit plays, right? Because the thing with THCO and THCP is, yeah, they're really strong. Yeah, they're really impactful, but it is incredibly dangerous and difficult to maintain the palladium conversion requirements with the acid. And note, only those and like HHC require like that mineral-based catalyst with the acid. So that scientists that listen to this, please don't yell at me. I know that's not perfect, but basically that's what's happening, right? So they're literally acid washing and degrading CBD into varieties of chemicals, right? So like Delta 8, for example, it is naturally occurring. It is not naturally produced. And what I mean by that is produced means the plant makes it while it's growing. Occurring means it happens. So in Delta 8's case, it happens in a dynamic state in nature as the CBD degrades. So for a few seconds, as CBD turns into nothingness, right? Yuck. Just like when you make a compost heap or whatever, it converts into dirt. There's a moment it becomes Delta 8 or Delta 10 or whatever one of these different semi-synthetic, synthetic isomers, whatever. All they're doing is acid washing it and stopping it at that point, right? They're speeding up the degradation and stopping it. Or if you've ever seen electrolysis, how they make like colorful bolts and shit, they're basically doing that with palladium. They're sticking it into the acid washes. They're doing it. Obviously, it's not a bucket, right? Like it's not like this isn't an episode of how it's made. It's a little more scientific than that, but that's what they're doing. So I spent a long time saying like, nope, this is gross. This is a bastardization of weed. I was also operating under the pretenses that it was a loophole that would get closed. And I think that's where I was seriously wrong. It wasn't a loophole that got closed. It was a loophole that got busted wide open.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wide open. So the capitalist in me, right? The money guy in me goes, I screwed up. I should get into that. The other side of me thinks it is a complex issue for a couple of factors. So number one, I don't think it's fair because I can go to the Skooma, whatever store down the street in Charlottesville next to me here in Virginia and buy California weed all day long right here, totally illegal, totally like I can do it. That's everywhere. That's not fair to regulated businesses and vice versa. Yeah. However, I do think that the quality and the consistency and those things on that side have really grown. And I think to you guys' point, in heavy prohibition states, it is filling a niche. However, I think the future becomes those two merging, however, unhappily. Because what's going to happen is, and this is where I'm going to go on a really big weird rant, and hold on for a minute. What I think is going to end up happening in the future is that the cannabis industry, pejorative note, I don't believe there's a cannabis industry. I think there are 39 separate cannabis industries. They're all siloed. So cannabis industry, pejorative. I think the cannabis industry is going to look a whole lot like the milk industry in the future. And what I mean by that is a variety of different sized farmers producing a variety of quality levels of stuff, sending it to large central processing facilities where it is then rebranded to a variety of brands and shipped across a variety of retailers. Basically meaning big thing in one spot, big thing out. It's what we see with milk. It's what we see with pretty much any major like processed consumer packaged good, right? One of my favorite facts about this is every battery you've ever bought in your life came from two factories, no matter what the brand was. They literally just changed the label. Energizer and Duracell are the same thing, right? Those sort of things. Yeah. So I think the cannabis industry looks like the milk industry. I do not think the MSOs and most of the large cannabis companies are built for that. If you look at their executive compensation packages, if you look at the way they are set themselves up, they are golden parachute machines. Market share grow and then jump the fuck out, because all of those are going to fall upon federal legalization. People who are prepared, smoke shops, liquor stores, all of the distribution models that are being built out to support the hemp industry. So I think what ends up happening is the producers get bought for pennies on the dollar, and some big mega agriculture company comes in and starts building traditional unit economics producer consumer states where they grow in mass, send them to large central processing facilities, and then utilize the distribution network that's already been built by the hemp industry. So what I'm saying is the hemp people are selling the wrong product with the right framework. The weed people are selling the right product with the wrong framework. Eventually those two have to meet.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary there, and it kind of it leads me into let me get my thoughts straight here. Like kind of along that the cannabis versus hemp right now, it seems to be lining up as if they're competitors, right? And you see what Newsom just did in California, banning hemp-derived THC products. Under what premise or auspice is that, other than to protect the cannabis space? In my opinion, at least that's the way I read it. So like, what's the hypocrisy here? What are we trying to achieve by doing silly things like that? It reminds me very much of the early days. The tobacco propaganda, doing everything they could to shut down cannabis in the first place.
And now it's just.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more of a soak-up play than it is a regulating play, right? So let's go ahead and tackle that one. Schedule 3 is a double-edged sword. Nobody knows what it brings, right? Everybody's going to act like they know. They don't know. It could play out 4 or 5 different ways, but the kind of primary 2 ways that people think it's going to play out is either total pharma control, because the FDA will make it so no licensed business can meet their requirements, or basically a continuation of the state-level programs with some mild oversight. My fear is the first one.
I think that's all of our,
because of what's happening with these regulations. How do you control it? Well, first you got to stop what they consider to be the fringe, which is the hemp market right now. Because what they can control are the MSOs and the large single state operators and some of those things. Like that is very, very, very much the Glasshouse, True Leaf, Curaleaf tribe. I'm not saying any of them as individual companies. I'm saying that class of folks very much wanting that, because one, it stops their today, like it stops the bleed on their business today, but it also continues to allow them to be acquisition targets for their little golden parachute clauses.
That's super interesting. So, because whenever you talk about the Schedule 3 stuff, so would that be, I feel like that would have some sort of impact on the medical side of the business?
Nobody knows.
Yes, totally.
So this has never been done before. So every other product that is like cannabis in this way, alcohol and tobacco, are non-scheduled. Every single scheduled substance in the United States, all the way down to Schedule 5, which, yes, is a real thing now. It's pseudo-scheduled, right? Something like gabapentin, which is not in and of itself, doesn't do anything. But if you take it with opiates, it makes them last a lot longer. Or if you take it with mescaline, it makes the trip a lot stronger, right? So there are these additional things. Every single one of those, dude just wrote that down for later. Every single one of those things are only available through a very specific set of things. So you'll see things in the cannabis extraction world called APIs, and it's not what you see on computers. It's advanced pharmaceutical ingredients. And the key to advanced pharmaceutical ingredients is Code of Federal Regulations 21-111, 211, 117. Those 3 control HACCP, food safety, C1D1, they control everything. Those are the core pieces that most people consider to be GMP.
It's also, I worked in the pharmaceutical world before this job.
So yeah.
And I can tell you, everyone in the industry, and I might get in trouble for saying this, you don't want the FDA really looking at you, because and you should look at what the pharmaceutical world has to go through, or specifically the compounding pharmacy world where the FDA is all over them. And if people don't think that that's going to happen to the weed world, it's going to happen. And you don't want, like,
go to a dermatologist today. This is a thing that and people's minds up. Go to a dermatologist today and tell them that you have in-specific skin pain. They will prescribe you a compounded pharmacy ketamine and ivermectin cream. Go try to buy that right now. Mm-hmm. Common prescription. It used to be available 3 or 4 years ago. You could get it from any compounding pharmacy for like $7, right? Because it's literally like a little sprinkle of, in like regular lotion. Hell no. Now it comes in a plastic thing. You have to show your ID. It's face cream. You would have to eat 4 or 5 bottles to even feel the effect. And that's where we're at. So if anybody thinks that Schedule 3 can't go that way, it's absolutely ludicrous. Because what does it look like? What do we just say? Like, state programs, you're good. We don't do that anywhere. Even alcohol in the ABC program or the Total Wine stores or the shit, even that is unscheduled. I can't even buy syrup without an ID in the United States. Yeah. And Joe Blow, pot grow in a warehouse that has never swept the floors thinks they're going to pass an FDA thing. And keep in mind, that guy probably grows better weed than everybody else. But that's never going to pass the sniff test. And it really scares me that people don't talk about that, because they look at it opens up banking, and it does this, and it does that. Yeah, it does. But are you actually going to put the money into it or not? I won't name names, but there's a local company-ish to me, thought they had the best of the best of the best, right? They were applying for like weed licenses to jump out of the hemp game, to do this jump, right? This very thing. They got the lowest score. They're the largest hemp producer in my area, and they got a lower score than some random dude who sells peonies. That's what, that's.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the FDA can drop in pretty much whenever they want. So, I mean, like, have fun. And I always said, just because I have seen that happen to other stuff before.
They do. My nephew's dad. His like real dad's byline, that's what he does. He is literally an FDA inspector who gets a call and he's like, hey, you need to drive to this city and just walk into this chicken plant and tell them they're gross. Like, in the moment.
One thing, so you to sum up some time in this direction, kind of like in terms of like whether it's Schedule 3 or, what it looks like in terms of full legalization, is there something to be learned from what Canada has done? I don't know. I've read very little, but like, what is the because Canada legalized a couple of years ago, and what is their structure, for lack of a better word, look like? I mean, is it like this nightmare scenario we're talking about with the FDA, or the Canadian version of the FDA, or is there like, is the Canadian model one that maybe the U.S. should be looking to try to duplicate or replicate?
That is a hellaciously complicated question. So, Canada, it is important to note that Canada has a smaller population than Colorado. And they are all heavily put under the, whatever it is, the 38th parallel, right? So most of the Canadian people live farther south than New York City, along a very small band at the bottom of Canada. That matters. It also is important to note that they, like the United States, are broken apart. So Quebec is very different than Alberta is very different. Just like we are states, they are a loose amalgamation of what states. They call them provinces because they are chunks of independently governed things still under the English monarchy. Those are all important aspects. So if you had asked me 5 years ago what I thought there was a million things we could learn from Canada's mistakes, state to state, right? Each state could learn from that, because Canada is much closer to being a state than it is its own country in terms of how this plays out, right? Just size, regulation style, those sort of things. So if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said Canada's the perfect benchmark of what not to do state by state. I don't know that there is a correlation that can be made on a national level from us to them, outside of their biggest mistake they made was allowing direct distribution in pharmacies without oversight of like the cannabis company. So basically they just kind of threw weed at pharmacists and said, figure it out. That didn't go so well. They recovered from that greatly. And I would say they are stronger than they ever would or ever were before right now, even if they're smaller, right? They're actually building back to a sustainable industry. I will say that for as much as I say that they are bastion of what not to do, they were the first ones. They had to make the mistakes for all of us. And I do think that largely they are a success story, but they don't really impact our world. I'm much more interested in watching the EU unpack things as Germany and Italy and some of those countries do, because kind of bringing us full circle, Republic of Texas, Commonwealth of Virginia, the EU is much similar to more similar to the United States in regulatory structure than Canada, because the EU functions. Let me back this up a minute. It is very important to note that in constitutional legal theory, we call United States states, not provinces or counties or whatever else they call them. A state is a specifically designated legal term for an autonomous governmental agency. The United States is a loose conglomeration of separate entities. At any point, we could just say no and go back to being 50 separate countries, because country and state are completely interchangeable from a legal status. So the EU is where I'm more interested, because Virginia is much more like Italy and California is much more like France than...
Yeah, and I was kind of in my head kind of getting there too, now that you brought it up regarding the EU. What do you see in terms of, because I'm from Denmark myself, so I visit Denmark frequently, and they're definitely still kind of behind the eight ball, so to speak, in terms of the only really place where cannabis is accepted in Denmark is in a little hippie town called Christiania in Copenhagen. But just in general with Europe, like what do you see there in terms of is there any discussion there? Or they're starting to get some, potential legalization in Europe, and how does that kind of affect things, if at all, here in the U.S.?
So I think it affects it greatly. And I will point to, if you don't know who he is, there's a guy that floats around the cannabis world named Greg Welch. He's pretty famous for doing like the ground up weed art of like people's faces and logos. You've seen them, right? Like Cookies had it on t-shirts that were available at Zoomies. He was in Forbes. Like I've known him since we were both nobodies in like the early Florida years, where we were like renting buses and welding dab rigs to the floor to take veterans to watch professional basketball games as a charity, right? So like, I'll never forget what he told me. He told me, 6 years ago now, I think it was 2018. He said, we're a decade from the first inning of cannabis ending. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you watch summer of 2028. That's when cannabis changes. And I, just like you guys, we're sitting there going, why? What the hell is the summer of 2020? That's the next, I guess that's the next presidential election. How do you know who, you know what I mean? Like I was running to and he said, dude, it's the 2028 Olympics in LA. The international political, athlete, and money communities, because that's all the Olympics is, right? It's a joint international politics and money jerk-off session. They come to LA. Where, and let's be real here, Gavin Newsom will do his like authoritarian thing and kick every homeless person and graffiti artist out of LA for the duration of the thing and let them back in when he's done. They're gonna see a society that has weed being normal, a functional, large-scale city that in their mind, love it or hate it, I'm not a big LA fan, but they're going to see beautiful, functional human beings smoking weed, riding bikes, doing their things, right? Like, I think that changes things a lot in the international view. So even these to get back to your question, even the posturing within Europe is preliminary, right? It's that like, that initial thing. So if you go to like Italy right now, you can buy weed out of a vending machine totally semi-legally.
Really?
Yeah, I went to Rome
right now.
Yeah, I went to Rome this past summer, and I was laughing at how similar it is to Texas, where it's like these like miscellaneous shops that are just ready to go.
Or New York City,
and
right?
it's-
With the
Yeah,
unregulated
yeah.
bodegas or like.
Yeah, it's and it's just you're walking through Rome, and it's just a huge amount of weed. It's like, oh, okay, and it's like you think Italy, oh, wine, that's all they care about, but it was a fairly healthy amount of folks there. So
I think it's important to note that most alcohol people aren't alcohol people, not consumers. I mean, producers, they're not alcohol people. They're plant people, right?
Yeah.
So like, I'm an Appalachian American, right? We've kind of like talked about that a little bit, but like really, like my dad doesn't wear shoes to Lowe's. Like I grew up in the mountains, like that.
Oh wow! Wow.
We used to joke that at the end of Copperhead Road, everybody knows what that is, right? There's also a weed grow, right? The best weed in the world is grown in the middle of 20 acres of corn where you grow an acre of weed in the middle because ain't nobody coming over the mountains to check it with a helicopter, that sort of thing, right? I think the same thing is happening across Europe as like, shout out to Max Simon and the Ganjier program, right? Like he really put a name on it. It's a Ganjier, just like a sommelier, right? Like,
Right. Yeah, I know. I follow him
I
too.
think of like, yeah, like I think of like friends. One of my wife's friends from high school, right? We went to a wedding a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, and we were standing there and he's like, I love home brewing. And I'm like, cool, I love home growing. You want to talk about our toys? And we spent like a whole evening talking about, he's like, well, I use this to do this. And I'm like, oh, that's so similar to a hydroponic setup. Have you used this kind of, you know what I mean? Like the same kind of they're plant people. Like something I talk about often in my private life that I don't really talk about in my public life is that I spend most of my time outside. My wife and I own hundreds of food-bearing plants. We have fruit trees, bushes, you name it, kiwis. We just finished building a greenhouse. Like I'm a plant guy. And I think a lot of plant people are like that. Like I went to a winery down the street from us a while ago and they're like, do you think we could get the terpenes out and add them to our table? Like that's the kind of folks that are happening. So I think that's happening in Europe. I think also culturally, you're seeing those little individual pieces of each country's culture, just like we have state culture here that kind of like bubbles up. So like to the point of being in Italy, they're rebellious and they don't give a fuck. Like anybody who's ever been to Italy and met like a real like Roman Italian, they're going to tell you how it is. They're going to do what they want to do and they'll take the consequences on the nose. That's who they are as a people, at least in my experience. That's what I see in their style of legalization, right? Like a healthy dose of punk rock. Like we're going to get away with it till we don't. As opposed to Germany, who is very much going, you know, yes, we will produce the BMW factory of weed. We will produce large scale, you know, like that's what they're doing though. They're going large scale industrial production. Look at Portugal, right? They're going full canna tourism. Look at insert company. I am intrigued. You brought up Denmark. So I'm really intrigued in general by Scandinavian politics as a whole. I'm also intrigued by the more modern rise of like Scandinavian manufacturing and branding, something like Zyn, right? Like people don't really think about the fact that Zyn is straight up just like a bunch of Swedish drunk girls that didn't want to smoke cigarettes, right? If you guys didn't know, that's where it came from.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah. So like that is a new thing, right? Like the IKEAs of the world broke open this like Scandinavian manufacturing model that has now been brought into a Scandinavian like branding model. I am very intrigued to watch them go down the path of legalization. And I know like Finland is heavily talking about it. I know that Sweden has talked about it. I know that Holland has been in touch with Sweden to talk about cross-border things or like cruises that leave Amsterdam and land in various places. I'm very intrigued to see how they do it because kind of back to the individual like cultures rising. And I'm sorry to say that Scandinavia is a singular culture, but I'm trying to be a little more general.
Oh, they're definitely, they're
separate,
very much close.
right? But there's some semblance of similarity
Absolutely.
there. I am intrigued to watch them do it because I think that Scandinavia has two things in its favor. One, an incredibly rich history of tradition in alternative agriculture, right? Because it's snowy and icy, and they've very heavily invested in infrastructure toward agriculture. And I mean that in like both plant and animal agriculture in a very different way. I also think they have a very efficient and clean methodology of things. Like a lot of what is now on the modern Toyota method or lean manufacturing actually comes from Scandinavian companies like Lego, not from the Japanese companies, which most people think they do. It's actually Japanese pull from Scandinavian culture, not the other way around, which is very common. So I'm very intrigued to see how those countries approach it, because it's happening, right? Like with the Germanic countries doing it, Austria's working on it, some of those, it is only a matter of time for that like whole like west of Russo bloc countries to continue, because whether we want to admit it or not, they are a block just like the southeast of the United States are, because they are primarily the manufacturing hubs and port hubs of that side of I have now gotten way too far into geo.
No, I love it. I love it. That's Europe is a big market for us into next year, so it's I'm hoping for it, because like I said, we do great with cannabis hemp customers here in the U.S. So if and when we get expanded into the EU, it'd be nice if there's a bunch of cannabis and CBD manufacturers in Europe.
I want to see somebody make Reefgar Tokbrok into a character. And it's like themed Viking.
That's awesome. I think I cut you off, Quentin.
No. I mean, like, I don't think you should apologize for getting political about it, because it's a very political topic. It's so ingrained in there that like you have to talk about it and you have to know about it, because otherwise you're just not doing enough.
I think it's also important to note even the Asian countries are getting on board, right? And not just Thailand.
Yeah.
Like we all saw like Thailand, 1 million free weed plants. Like that was cool, but there are like industrial hemp farmers working on massive scales in the steppes of Mongolia, because Mongolia is similar climate-wise to a lot of like the Southeast Asian or Southeast Indian, like sub-Indian continent places where some of those more industrial strains of weed originated that we think of. There are large-scale like growing and drying operations going on there. There are also huge pushes across a lot of the more like island-based nations. So I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but there's a thing called Hemp for Water, where a guy's been working on using hemp for two purposes. One of them is not important. It's algae remediation. So the two things weed or hemp needs to grow is nitrogen and phosphorus, red algae, blue algae, green algae in Florida, the Caribbean. They produce a ton of those. So like floating mats of hemp can clean that up. But the other big one he's done is, if you look at the way hemp and cannabis roots grow, they naturally hook and create a natural barrier for erosion. There's a lot of work happening in Southeast Asian countries about that. You can also see some of it in places like Dubai, that they're not using hemp, they're using cat of nine tails and a couple of other like American varieties. But you can start seeing it at the beginnings of like I'll call it terraforming, but now we're getting into like creepy sci-fi. They call it geoforming and cloud seeding, but they're beginning to do those things with things like hemp, right? To prevent erosion, to continue to grow island spaces. That we've all seen those things in like Dubai, right? They made an entire island out of nowhere.
Interesting.
And this has been a great chat, Brett. I could probably keep talking to you about this, because like I said, I'm very passionate about this topic as both a consumer, but I truly believe that cannabis and hemp are both wonder plants, and I honestly think it's a travesty that the amount of research and evolution that we've lost as a society over the last probably 80 years due to prohibition. It's sad, because I think there's only more to come. There's more benefits to be found from the plant, and yeah. So love talking about the topic. Obviously, we have a lot of customers in the space. Love hearing all of your insights. I wouldn't be surprised if you hear from me again at some point in the future to maybe have you back on. As like you said, things are every month, every day, every week. This space is evolving and changing. Politicians changing their minds, doing different things, and just the overall evolution. So it's kind of neat. We're living through history. Not to overstate it, but we are. So yeah, really enjoyed this chat.
And then Brett, I saved the most controversial topic for last, and that's I would like to get your ranking of Star Wars films, trilogy only, or like 9 films only.
It has to be the 9 films only?
Well, actually, no. Actually, I feel like you have a lot of thoughts on Star Wars because I've seen you talk about it a little bit before. So I want to get the full.
Look at his background there.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't even see the Funko Pops. That's incredible.
Oh no, it's way more than that. Like I literally have the guy who tries to sell Obi-Wan Kenobi cigarettes in the bar in episode 2 as an action figure, and the younglings that Anakin killed.
That's incredible that they made that.
I'm not even kidding. They're real.
That's awesome.
The fact that they sell the younglings is a little messed up.
Have you guys seen the the Chinese dub of that movie where they're like, management trainee Skywalker, what is the action plan? It's super funny. I highly recommend it. So, definitive ranking of Star Wars films only: Empire Strikes Back, Revenge of the Sith, A New Hope, probably Rise of Skywalker because it ended it, The Last Jedi, and then Attack of the Clones goes at the end, and I don't like Return of the Jedi at all.
I was waiting for I was surprised you
fair
didn't
enough.
have Return of the Jedi on there. That's usually at the top of most people's list.
Including non-9, Solo goes in at number 4. Rogue One goes in at number 7. Didn't like the other one. I love Clone Wars, the show. I hate Rebels, the show. I like Mandalorian, the show. Ahsoka was okay. I forgot what the other one that just came out was.
Acolyte or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't know.
Yeah, no, I was curious because I'm a big sequel trilogy hater in some ways. So like the last Jedi to me is like my least favorite Star Wars film ever, and I feel like I get into pretty heated debates about that because I feel like there's no like middle ground on that film. And I don't know. I like The Force Awakens a lot, but that was probably because I didn't grow up I didn't see A New Hope in theaters. So like seeing a redo of it was like awesome.
So I was 11.
They redid
when
A
the
New Hope.
original.
Whoa.
So I was 11 when the original trilogy came back to theaters, like in the 90s, to lead up to episode 1. So I was 13 when episode 1 came out. So I was that prime age. It's also important to note my dad was a freshman in high school when the original Star Wars came out. So for both of us, we were at that foundational teenage time when Star Wars was a thing, and it was one of those things that my dad and I could really do together. So he took me to all of the originals in the remastered theater, and it became my thing.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, well, I just wanted to get your ranking because I had seen you talk about it, and I love hearing other folks' rankings, especially whenever they're huge Star Wars fans. Usually they align.
Everyone knows Empire Strikes Back and Revenge of the Sith are the best 2, and then everything else is a debate. Like,
yeah,
those kind of like, I think they're safe to say, even if you hate the prequels, everyone loves Revenge of the Sith. Like,
yeah. Well, the final lightsaber battle.
Right. Like nothing beats that, right? The march up the steps with the 501st, the whole, like nothing beats that.
Yep.
Well, that's it for me, Brett. I can't thank you enough. I echo all of his thoughts, and I love hearing you talk about this stuff. It's fascinating to me, so thanks, man.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good weekend, Brett. Thanks again.
Bye, guys.